Hello, welcome to Something for Kids, storytelling for the young and the young at heart. My name is Father Steve Demuth. I'm rector of Holy Trinity Church in Covina, and I want to welcome you to tonight's storytelling time. I had showed you this once before, many years ago. A friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, made this handmade wardrobe to represent the wardrobe in our story. And when I opened up the door on the right, it shows a castle, the castle of Cair Paravel, where legend has it, the two sons of Adam and two daughters of Eve will sit upon the throne of Cair Paravel, and all will be made right. I wonder if it could be that the Pavensi children, being four, might be considered the two sons of Adam and two daughters of Eve. We'll have to listen to the story to find out what happens next. Also, you might see on the inside the lamppost and a winter scene. But I want to introduce you to a new character tonight. This is the character of the great lion named Aslan. I won't tell you too much about Aslan, but you've heard him referred to in the story as the great lion or the terrible and fierce lion. And there's something very, very enigmatic. Oh, that's a good word. There's something that draws you to this character, and we'll learn more about Aslan as the story progresses. But he's an important part of the story. In fact, when we have our vacation Bible school, God willing, this June, on the 22nd to the 26th, the school will be called Aslan is on the Move. And then lastly, on the other side of the door panel is a beautiful ship on a rough sea, and that is the Dawn Treader. The name of the ship is the Dawn Treader, and that's another story that we'll save for another time. So let's get right into our story tonight. We have a lot to learn, and before we go, I probably need to get my glasses out and make sure I can see through the fingerprints. I don't know how they get so dirty, but they do. And now I can see you. So how was your day? I had an interesting day. I stayed 6 feet apart, but I saw some nice people. I saw someone named Ingrid. I saw someone named Jesus. And I got a chance to play with my 3 doggies and pick up Thai food for dinner. That was a very good day. What did you do today? Perhaps you can write in the comments or have someone else write them for you what you did today. Nice. All right, so let's get straight to our story. We are in the midst of the chapter called Back on This Side of the Door. It was an unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working as well as he had expected. The 2 older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passage talking about it in whispers, long after she had gone to bed. The result was the next morning, they decided what they really would do is go and tell the whole thing to the professor. He'll write to Father if he thinks there's really something wrong with Lou, said Peter. It's getting beyond us. So they went and knocked on the study door, and the professor said, "Come on in," and got up and found chairs for them and said he was quite at their disposal. Then he sat listening to them with the tips of his fingers pressed together and never interrupting, till they had finished their whole story. After that, he said nothing for quite a long time. Then he cleared his throat and said the last thing either of them expected. "How do you know," he asked, "that your sister's story is not true?" "Oh, but," began Susan, and then stopped. Anyone could see from the old man's face that he was perfectly serious. Then Susan pulled herself together and said, "But Edmund said that they had only been pretending." "That's a point," said the professor, "which certainly deserves consideration, very careful consideration. For instance, if you will excuse me for asking the question, does your experience lead you to regard your brother or your sister as the more reliable? I mean, which is the more truthful?" "That's just the funny thing about it, sir," said Peter. "Up till now, I'd have said Lucy every time." "And what do you think, my dear?" said the professor, turning to Susan. "Well," said Susan, "in general, I'd say the same as Peter, but this couldn't be true, all this about the wood and the fawn." "That is more than I know," said the professor, "and a charge of lying against someone whom you have always found to be truthful is a very serious thing indeed." "We were afraid it might even not be lying," said Susan. "We thought there might be something wrong with Lucy." "Madness, you mean," said the professor quite coolly. "Oh, you can make your minds easy about that. One has only to look at her and talk to her to see that she is not mad." "But then," said Susan, and stopped. She had never dreamed that grown-ups would talk like the professor and didn't know what to think. "Logic," said the professor, half to himself. "Why don't they teach logic at these schools?" There were only 3 possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or she is telling the truth. You don't know, or you know she doesn't tell lies, and it is obvious that she's not mad. For the moment then, unless any further evidence turns up, we must assume that she is telling the truth. Susan looked at him very hard and was quite sure from the expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. "But how could it be true, sir?" said Peter. "Why do you say that?" asked the professor. "Well, for one thing," said Peter, "if it was real, why doesn't everyone find this country every time we go into the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing there when we looked. Even Lucy didn't pretend there was." "What has that to do with it?" said the professor. "Well, sir, if things are real, they're there all the time." "Are they?" said the professor, and Peter did not quite know what to say. "But there was no time," said Susan. "Lucy had no time to have gone anywhere, even if there was such a place. She came running after us the very moment we were out of the room. It was less than a minute, and she pretended to have been away for hours." "That is the very thing that makes her story so likely to be true," said the professor. "If there really is a door in this house that leads to some other world, and I should warn you that this is a very strange house, and even I know very little about it, if, I say, she had got into another world, I should not be at all surprised to find that the other world had a separate time of its own, so that however long you stayed there, it would never take up any of our time. On the other hand, I don't think many girls of her age would invent that idea for themselves. If she had been pretending, she would have hidden for a reasonable time before coming out and telling her story. But do you mean, sir, said Peter, that there could be other worlds all over the place just around the corner, like that? Nothing is more probable, said the professor, taking off his spectacles and beginning to polish them. He does the same thing I do. While he mentioned or muttered to himself, I wonder what they do teach at these schools. But what are we to do, said Susan. She felt that the conversation was beginning to get off the point. My dear young lady, said the professor, suddenly looking up with a very sharp expression at both of them, there is one plan which no one has yet suggested and which is well worth trying. What's that? Said Susan. We might all try minding our own business, he said, and that was the end of that conversation. After this, things were a good deal better for Lucy. Peter saw to it that Edmund stopped jeering at her, and neither she nor anyone else felt inclined to talk about the wardrobe at all. It had become a rather alarming subject, and so for a time it looked as if all the adventures were coming to an end. But that was not to be. This house of the professor's, which even he knew so little about, was so old and famous that people from all over England used to come and ask permission to see it. It was the sort of house that is mentioned in guidebooks and even in histories, and well it might be, for all manner of stories were told about it, some of them even stranger than the one I am telling you now. And when parties of sightseers arrived and asked to see the house, the professor always gave them permission, and Mrs. Macready, the housekeeper, showed them around, telling them about the pictures and the armor and the rare books in the library. Mrs. Macready was not fond of children and did not like to be interrupted when she was telling visitors all the things she knew. She had said to Susan and Peter almost on the first morning, along with a very good many other instructions, and please remember, you're not to keep out of the way. You're to keep out of the way whenever I'm taking a party over the house. Just as if any of us would want to waste half the morning trailing round with a crowd of strange grown-ups, said Edmund, and the other three thought the same. That was how the adventures began for the second time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking at the suit of armor and wondering if they could take it to bits, when the two girls rushed in the room and said, "Look out! Here comes the Macready and a whole gang with her." "Sharp's the word," said Peter, and all four of them made off through the door at the far end of the room. But when they had gotten into the green room, and beyond it, into the library, they suddenly heard voices ahead of them and realized that Mrs. Macready must be bringing her party of sightseers up the back stairs instead of up the front stairs as they had expected. And after that, whether it was that they lost their heads, or that Mrs. Macready was trying to catch them, or that some magic in the house had come to life and was chasing them into Narnia, they seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere, until at last Susan said, "Oh, bother those trippers. Here, let's get into the wardrobe room till they've passed. No one will follow us in here." But the moment they were inside, they heard voices in the passage and then someone fumbling at the door. And then they saw the handle turning. "Quick," said Peter, "there's nowhere else." And they flung open the wardrobe. All four of them huddled inside and sat there panting in the dark. Peter held the door closed, but did not shut it, for of course he remembered, as every sensible person does, that you should never shut yourself up in a wardrobe. Here is the end of chapter 5. So, what do you think of the story so far? I think it's a right good tale. Now, before we go tonight, I wanted to ask you once more of things that you might be grateful for, as if to count your blessings. I am grateful, if you hear in the background, for a beautiful cuckoo clock we got in the dark black forest of Germany, where some of my relatives come from. And every time I hear that cuckoo cuckoo, or when it sings its songs, it makes me happy. That's one of my blessings. Perhaps you have some of your own. Would you be so kind as to type them in the comment section, or have someone type them in for you? And I will sing our song. And if you know it, I think Daniel knows some of it, and perhaps even Irene. Maybe you will sing along. When I'm worried and I can't sleep, I count my blessings instead of sheep, and I fall asleep counting my blessings. When my bankroll is getting small, I think of when I had none at all, and I fall asleep counting my blessings. I think about a nursery and I think of curly heads, and one by one I see them as they slumber in their beds. If you're worried and you can't sleep, just count your blessings instead of sheep, and you fall asleep counting your blessings. If you're watching us on YouTube, please consider writing a comment and letting us know you were there. Our YouTube channel is Historic Holy Trinity Church of Covina. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow night at 7:30 for our next part of the adventure. Good night and God bless.